The collective must grow, but based on the new Assimilator, it's not going to be growing very quickly. So, thanks to the generosity of a viewer of the channel, I now have a Borg Assimilator. First the Shrike, now the Assimilator. Y'all are spoiling me this holiday season. Anyway, while the ship is basically what I expected it to be, the console and the hangar pets that I was rather excited about, they're a bit of a disappointment, honestly. Here is the Borg Assimilator, which I have named the Borg Litter Box because the person who gave this to me requested that I make the name some sort of cat joke, and then to blame it on a Cation that is chasing me down, which is going to be bad for me because I am allergic to cats. But yeah, thank you again for the ship, but not for the inevitable sneezing. Anyway, the Borg Assimilator. This being the first true playable Borg ship, because technically the Liberated Juggernaut was never seen as part of the Borg Collective, I wanted to make this build as Borg-themed as possible. So that meant using Borg-themed weapons, consoles, and some starship traits that kind of fit their vibe. The Borg Assimilator is a full Miracle Worker ship, so it has a commander-level Miracle Worker seat. However, it also has a Lieutenant Commander command seat, so I could have gone with an energy weapon build or a torpedo build either way. But an energy weapon felt much more authentic to the Borg theme, so I went with a beam overload build. I know I've been saying for months about how I am tired of single target builds, but at the same time it felt more appropriate to the theme. But of course changing this to a fire at will build would not be a difficult change, and I will be going over that later. Now, because this is an energy weapon build, there's going to be a lot of crossover with a lot of my other energy weapon builds, in terms of gear and traits. So I won't be going over everything on the build, but whatever I don't go over will be listed on the screen so you'll at least know the names of what's there. So, first off in the weapons, obviously this is a Borg-themed ship, so I went with assimilated plasma weapons. I've got 3 dual beam banks in the front and an omni beam in the back. These weapons are the main reason why I went with a beam build on this ship. So you can easily do beam overload or fire at will, however there are no canon versions of the assimilated plasma weapons, so CSV is out. I've always liked these weapons though. Not only do they have a unique animation that makes them look more like Borg tractor beams than actual traditional beam weapons, but they also have a nice proc on them that gives you a chance to heal a small portion of your hull and improve your damage by a little bit for 30 seconds that stacks up to 4 times. The assimilated plasma weapons are available in the Infinity lockboxes, or you can find them on the exchange. Now, because this is a plasma beam overload build, I also threw in the advanced piezo plasma beam array. The piezo weapons have a unique proc that gives a 5% chance to heal some shields and hull, but this advanced version also has a unique effect when used with beam overload or surgical strikes called technical overload, which can create an AoE of electrical damage around your target once every 15 seconds. If this sounds familiar, that's because we talked about the Polaron version of this weapon in my last video. Now, technical overload only triggers under the effects of beam overload or surgical strikes. So if you're wanting to change this to a fire at will build, then I would swap that out for another assimilated plasma weapon. Using this weapon also gave me an excuse to use the piezoelectric focuser. This gives a really nice amount of plasma damage on its own. It's also given me some extra shield capacity and a little bit more turn rate, which is definitely going to be valuable on this ship. And its 2 pieces giving me even more plasma damage as well as some photon torpedo damage. This weapon set is available in the Lucari reputation. To keep with the Borg theme, we've also got the kinetic cutting beam. Normally on a 5-2 build like this, I would have just used a second Omni, but again, we're trying to stick with the Borg theme here, so yeah, cutting beam. I'm also pairing that with the assimilated module, which is giving me some extra crit chance at crit severity, as well as some additional weapon power. This also has a 2-piece set bonus, which gives me a chance to get some extra weapon power and drastically reduce my weapons power cost for 5 seconds. But this ability only has a 2.5% chance of triggering, so it's basically like another weapons proc. So it's really not going to make that much of a difference. This set is available from the Omega Task Force reputation. Now, I'm sure most of you were expecting me to also include the Omega Plasma Torpedo to go for the full 3-piece for the Borg set. However, I instead decided to go for the Enhanced Biomolecular Photon Torpedo. The old Omega Plasma Torpedo really isn't that powerful, whereas the EBM here is one of the most powerful torpedoes in the game. There's a reason on any meta torpedo build, this thing's always slotted first. And for how they fit into the theme, one, they are Borg torpedoes, so visually they fit very well. But remember that the EBM is based on the torpedoes that Voyager and the Borg developed to fight Species 8472. So the Enhanced Biomolecular Photon Torpedo was created using Borg nanoprobe technology. So there's your Borg connection. Now the deflector, engine, warp core, and shield are the usual setup I use for an energy weapon build. I'm sure some of you might be asking, why didn't I use the old assimilated set from the Task Force Omega reputation? And the simple answer to that is because that set really isn't that great these days. Its stats and set bonuses really don't stand up to the current state of the game, so there's really no point in using those when I could use these instead. These days, the only real value in the assimilated set is the Borg-inspired visuals that it gives. And in my opinion, I don't think those visuals are actually necessary on this ship because, well, it's already a Borg ship. Plus then you're just mixing the new Borg texture with old Borg textures, and it's not going to look good visually. The devices, again, pretty much my same layout, so those are just going to be on the screen. In the engineering/universal consoles, we've got just a bunch of plasma isomags. This is one of the things I really like about this ship. It has a bunch of room for isomags. Though in a little bit we'll get into why I probably should have used the hangar bay consoles instead. We already went over the piezoelectric focuser over here. This is just here for the 2-piece with the beam array. I said earlier if I was switching this to a fire at will build, I would take out the beam array. If I was using fire at will, I would probably take out the console as well and swap this in for another isomag. Now for the other universal consoles, most of these are here for the Borg theme. First we've got cutting tractor beam. What this does is when you activate it, it will deploy a little Borg satellite type thingy. What this does is fire heavy kinetic cutting beams at your enemy targets. If that target is below 50% hull, it'll disable that target's engines and shields for 60 seconds. So this is really nice for disabling heavy boss level enemies. Additionally, this console also has a passive that whenever you activate a universal console, it will add 10% bonus damage to any of your universal consoles, which can stack up to 10 times. So that's just assuming their active effects do some kind of damage. It's not like this thing will add additional bonus damage to the buff that the DPRM provides. But something like Point Defense Bombardment Warhead that actually deals its own damage, that would receive a damage buff from this console. Next is Dispersing Nanoprobe Assimilator, and like the name suggests, this console will disperse a bunch of nanoprobes around your ship in a 3-kilometer radius. This will deal some plasma damage over time to any enemies hit by it, and if those enemies are defeated while that effect is still active, they will be turned into a Borg probe. Specifically a ramming probe that will chase down enemies, lock tractor beam on them, and then detonate once they get close to them, sort of like proximity mines. Except it's a ship. Next is Retrofitted Assimilator, which works a little similar to the previous console, except that this one fires much more like a torpedo than a cloud of nanoprobes. You fire it at a target, it'll deal some physical damage over time, and when that foe is defeated, it will be assimilated and act like a pet that is under your control, which will stick around for 180 seconds or until it's destroyed. Oh, before I go on, the Retrofitted Assimilator and the Cutting Tractor Beam are both available in the Infinity lockboxes, so you can also get them on the exchange. The Dispersing Nanoprobe Assimilator is an old event reward, so if you completed that event, you already have it unlocked on your whole account. But if you don't, it is currently available in Mud's Market, and that's going to be the only way to get it. Next is the console that came off of this ship, Disassemble and Analyze. Now, this one, honestly, came out to be kind of a disappointment. This console has 2 effects, depending on if you're targeting an enemy or a friendly assimilated ship. If you're targeting an enemy, it'll function a bit like a tractor beam, holding and draining enemy shields while dealing some kinetic damage, but in turn will also give you a stacking buff to crit chance that will last up to 45 seconds. Now, if you're targeting friendly assimilated ships, that includes the hangar pets that come with this ship, you'll give a stacking buff to their crit chance, but that'll last until you leave the map. This console is also capable of charging up, so you can store up to 4 charges of this attack, so you'll be able to fire those charges off fairly quickly. My big problem with this console, however, is that it seems to disable all of your other powers while it's active. So for those 5 seconds, you can't activate any of your other consoles, your bridge officer abilities, or even fire your weapons. They'll finish off the firing cycle they're currently in, but you won't be able to activate another one until the console finishes its thing. And honestly, this next part might just be me, but I am constantly forgetting that this console works on friendly targets. Because I am so not used to having to target friendlies in order to do something. Usually I am too focused on my enemies to do anything else. So that could explain the lackluster performance I got out of the pets, which we'll talk about later. We already talked about the assimilated module, so the last console to talk about is the Sensor Suspension Burst, which comes off of the Jirok Alliance carrier. Now, admittedly, this console is not very Borg-themed, but we are dealing with a carrier here, so this did seem like a good console to have. Not only is its passive ability giving a decent buff to my own crit chance, but its click ability gives a 30% crit chance buff to all of my pets for 20 seconds, as well as a 20% crit chance buff for 5 seconds to myself and all allied players nearby, as well as resetting the recharge time on my hangar bays, meaning I can launch my pets that much faster. Speaking of the pets, I am using the assimilation probes that came off of this ship. You probably noticed that I haven't upgraded the pets, I'm still using the basic rare versions that came on it, and that's for 2 reasons. One, I'm really short on dilithium, so I couldn't afford the very rare ones. Plus, I actually didn't want the very rare ones because they have a firing mode. They gain Beam Overload 1, which would interfere with superior area denial. Though more on that later because I actually didn't stick with SAT on this build. But I also didn't upgrade to the advanced versions available in the dilithium store because, according to the tooltips, they're the same. They both have the same description. The advanced versions don't gain any abilities, and there's no text saying whether or not they gain any additional weapons. So if they're the same, I didn't feel like bothering. And as of filming this, I haven't seen any concrete evidence that the advanced ones are any different than the normal ones, so I don't feel like wasting my dilithium. Now, the thing about these assimilation probe pets is they turned out to be not quite as powerful as I was hoping they would be. For frigate pets, they're actually quite weak, and I think the reason for that is because of their assimilation ability. These probes are capable of assimilating enemy starships. The pet will then become the assimilated ship and gain a damage buff depending on what type of ship it assimilated. So if it assimilates a frigate, it gains a 25% damage buff, but if it assimilates a Dreadnought, it gets a 100% damage buff. The problem with these pets I've found is that in order to assimilate a target, they have to be the one dealing the killing blow, which is actually kind of difficult with how underpowered they are initially. This is why I think I probably should have gone with the Hanger Pet consoles instead of the ISOMAGs. In order to get the most out of these pets, you really need to go all in with them. Which, frankly, is also kind of a shame because it's already been proven that the ISOMAGs always outperform the Hanger Bay consoles. It doesn't matter how much you can buff your Hanger Pets because, in the end, they're always going to be victim to how stupid the AI is. You don't get a lot of control when it comes to Hanger Pets. You can dictate their behavior a little bit, but for the most part, they fly however they want and will activate their abilities just as soon as they're off cooldown. There's really no way to use them strategically. Typically with other carrier builds, you want to use your Hanger Pets to wear down your enemies, usually with something like Superior Area Denial, and using any pets that can use Scatter Volley, like the Todouch Fighters or the Valkyries. But even with those kinds of builds, your own ship's weapons are usually doing the most damage. But with these assimilation probes, you kind of need to flip that in order for them to work properly. So you need to be the one wearing down the enemy while they deal the killing blow. And that's really not easy with how weak they are. Even the ship itself does not give you much to work with when it comes to buffing them. We already went over the limitations of the console, but we'll get to the trait in a bit. Moving on to the starship traits, we'll start with the personal traits, and again, this is another case of where most of these are just my usual setup for an energy weapon build, so I'm not going to go over all of them, but they will be listed on the screen. Though I will call out Independent Wingmate over here, which is giving a 200% damage bonus buff to the first Hanger Pet that I launch. This is a pretty nice trait if you're going to be dealing with a ship with a Hanger Bay and you're wanting to put more emphasis on the pets. I would have liked to get Wing Commander on here too, because that would allow the pets to level up more quickly and thus do more damage, but that is an expensive personal trait and I do not have it on this character. Now, onto the starship traits. First we've got Super Weapon Ingenuity off of the Xindi Adalith Dreadnought. This is the extension trait for Beam Overload, and since this is a Beam Overload build, obviously I want this here. Though if you're wanting to fly this as a Fire at Will build, then I would swap this out for Entwined Tactical Matrices off the Gagarin Miracle Worker Battlecruiser. Calm Before the Storm off of the Cardassian Intel Flight Deck Carrier, this is here for its haste buff. Emergency Weapon Cycle off of the Arbiter Battlecruiser, as well as like 4 other ships. This one is also here for haste, as well as lowering my weapon power cost. Rapid Emitting Armaments off of the legendary Dodera decks. This one's here more for the sake of theme than anything else, because the Borg are very trigger happy with their tractor beams. They like to grab onto your ship and hold on while they assimilate you. And since Rapid Emitting Armaments functions with a tractor beam, it seemed appropriate. Even more so since it launches heavy plasma torpedoes, which in Star Trek Online we know that the Borg uses plasma weapons. Typically this is more for a torpedo build than an energy weapon build, but even not on a torpedo build, this is still a very powerful starship trait. Next is Ship of the Line off of the Legendary Avenger. This is here for its really impressive buff to crit severity. Preferential targeting off of the NX refit. Activating Fire at Will or Scatter Volley will give a 100% damage buff to Beam Overload or Cannon Rapid Fire. So with this, I am using Cannon Scatter Volley for the sake of buffing my Beam Overload. Though, again, if you're wanting to run this as a Fire at Will build, then I would ditch preferential targeting for something else. And the last starship trait on here is Targeted Excision. Now let's talk about this one for a little bit, because in my first impression review, I talked about how unimpressive it was, and then I tried using it, and yeah, it's still very unimpressive. So what this trait does is anytime I activate any version of Beam Overload or Cannon Rapid Fire, it will give my pets the rank 1 version of both of those abilities. And that's kind of been my big criticism with this starship trait. It will only give the rank 1 version of Beam Overload and Rapid Fire to your pets. I already talked about how, in order to get the most out of these pets, they need to be the ones doing the killing blow, because that's how they assimilate enemy starships and thus buff their own damage. I had initially tried that with Superior Area Denial, but the Fire at Will that it gives the pets just wasn't enough to actually get them to do the killing blow. Seriously, the most I managed to get one of these things to assimilate was one of the generators in Infected. And the amount of damage they did was absolutely pitiful. I mean, it was like less than 5k. So that's when I got into this kick of, well, they need to deal the killing blow, so maybe I should be getting them to use Beam Overload as well. I didn't have the dilithium for the elite versions, but I could at least use the starship trait. And then they did even worse. Actually, since we're already talking about damage numbers, let's get a look at the combat log. Now, getting a decent test out of this thing actually proved to be more of a pain in the butt than I thought it would be. I couldn't get through a single 9th rule elite without dying at least once. Something about this ship, it is very easy for it to get very overwhelmed very quickly. But I guess that shouldn't be super surprising because I am having to make quite a few compromises in order to make way for the Borg theme. While a lot of these Borg consoles are amusing, they're not really all that useful on this sort of build. In one test I was able to get 172k, and that was with only one death. That's one of the ones where I was using SAD on the pets. If it weren't for that death, I probably could have gotten that at least over 200k, but even then that still feels kinda low for what should be a pretty decent beam overload build. And again, it comes down to I'm just having to make too many sacrifices for the Borg theme. Now, in another case where I was using targeted excision for the starship trait, that did even worse. In most of those cases, I often ended up with 2 deaths, which was weirdly consistent. Though I think that's largely because without superior area denial, the pets are no longer using fire at will, which means they were generating less threat because they were only hitting one enemy at a time instead of several at once. So therefore, I ended up being the one that drew more aggro. And again, because of the sacrifices I had to make for the Borg theme, I just wasn't able to take the beating. Overall, the ship is pretty nice. It's obnoxiously huge, but it does have a good weapons layout and decent bridge officer seating. Plus it has 2 hangar bays, which is always fun, but it'll be a lot more fun if you put pets in there that don't suck, like the Todouge or the Valkyrie fighters. But like I said, I would be really curious to see how this performs under the effect of the hangar bay consoles instead of ISO mags. I really want to see if that can actually make a decent difference or not. But I just don't have the resources for those right now, so sadly I'm not going to be able to do that for this video. So yeah, that is the Borg Assimilator. Like I said, the ship itself is rather nice, if not rather huge at the same time, but, you know, that's just part of the appeal in my opinion. You know, sometimes you just want a big, chunky ship that's just going to overshadow everything else that's on the team. But yeah, the ship itself is fun, but the console and the hangar pets that it comes with, those were a bit of a disappointment. I would like to revisit this build at some point. I feel like I could do better with those hangar pets if I actually had the advanced hangar pet consoles that are available nowadays. I went into this with ISO mags, and I feel like it's really meant more for those hangar pet consoles. But at the same time, I feel like they just need a buff. Like, just giving them access to Beam Overload 3, either via, you know, the advanced versions of the pets or via the Starship trait, would make a huge difference for these things. Anyway, let me know what you guys thought down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, there's the join button to become a member, or the super thanks button, or the merch store, link in the description. There's also the content creator code on the Epic Game Store if you're ever shopping over there. But either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.